All right, my name is Daniel Garcia, and this presentation is for our reading reflection 2, where we will discuss how the normalization of failure reinforces the connections between the achievement gap and the discipline gap, and how particular populations are more susceptible to disciplinary disparities, push out, and school to prison pipeline. So we will start by defining several broad terms that I will come back to throughout the PowerPoint, and then I'll explain how these ideas interact while also defining more specific terms throughout the PowerPoint. So we'll start with the normalization of failure, which, as discussed in class, is the idea that Black and brown students are expected to fail academically and that teachers and faculty have accepted this expectation. So the quote below is referencing when Gregory, Nighreen, and Moran were giving presentations to school faculties and teachers, giving figures, statistics, and graphs that plainly outlined the achievement and disciplinary gaps right in front of them. They wrote that, as we made these presentations, we discovered a disturbing trend. For the most part, the findings we presented failed to evoke surprise, much less a sense of urgency that something had to be done by either the community or the school. So this quote perfectly exemplifies the normalization of failure. The teachers were not surprised because they were not being told information that they were being told information that they already knew, expected, and had already accepted. So we'll talk about the achievement gap and the discipline gap. We've talked a lot about the achievement gap, but basically it's the disproportionality of non-white students experiencing problems with low academic achievement compared to white students. So the discipline gap is very similar. It's the overrepresentation of Black and brown students within the disciplinary measures taken by the schools. So the authors write that these disciplinary measures range from office disciplinary referrals, to corporal punishment, suspension, and expulsion. We've talked a lot about the school to prison pipeline and what it means, but for a basic definition, Burge, Licona, and Hemingway write that the school to prison pipeline refers to a set of school policies and practices that push students away from education and onto a pathway toward juvenile detention in the prison industrial complex. So we've talked about that one a lot, but school pushout was a new term that the authors proposed, and they wrote that school pushout is a term that addresses a student being marginalized in school and or driven out of school prior to graduation. So this is important because it differs from the term dropout and that it acknowledges the multiple school-based conditions and forces at play in marginalizing students to leave school prematurely. So this idea reminds me a lot of Ladson Billings' 2006 article titled "A Letter to Our Next President," where she adapts the term achievement gap to the education debt. It takes the issue of out of the individual context of the students, the families, and the school administrations, and includes the larger factors at play. So it takes a lot of, it shifts the perspective from looking at the individuals instead and looking at the bigger picture. Let's see. So defining these terms is really important because, as we've discussed in class, language and the way that we speak about these issues really matters and it has real implications. So now that we've defined these ideas, I'll explain kind of the way they interact. So the achievement gap and the discipline gap, two sides to the same coin. This is the title of Gregory, Skiba, and Nguro's 2010 article. And it does a really good job of emphasizing the relationship between the two quote-unquote gaps and their argument that racial discipline gap influences racial patterns in achievement, or that the discipline gap directly influences the achievement gap. But articles aside, it's pretty logical to assume a relationship between the two. If the students aren't in class due to suspension, then they're falling behind, lowering their chances of achievement. Let's see. But in their writing, the authors identify possible explanations for the overrepresentation of Black and brown youths in the disciplinary systems. So 3 of these theories that they mention are differential behavior, differential selection, and differential processing. To start, differential behavior says that students from certain racial and ethnic groups misbehave or contribute more than students from other racial and ethnic groups. So that's basically arguing that non-white students act out more than white students, and that's why they're being disciplined more. But as we've talked about in class, and as it's stated by the authors themselves, the idea that non-white students commit more crimes and act out more in school has been disproven time and time again. So it really leaves us with differential selection and differential processing, among others that they discuss in the article. Differential selection is the idea that ethnic minorities are more likely to be arrested because they're more likely to be picked out for wrongdoing despite similar levels of infractions across racial groups. So if you apply this to the schooling system, it's basically saying that non-white students are selected more often for punishment than white students. This is similar in differential processing in that it says that discrimination occurs in the courts and correctional system, which leads to a disproportionate arrest and incarceration rate. So that puts, putting that in the school's perspective, that puts it more on the principal and the deans. So now that we've kind of talked about these, we can see the way that they interact with the normalization of failure. But first, we'll talk about this quote that they say on page 63, where they write that the application of school consequences such as suspension and expulsion represents less a discrete event than a complex process whose outcome is influenced simultaneously by student behavior, teacher classroom management, administrative perspectives, and school policy. So this is important because it establishes that disciplinary measures are not automatic and immediate occurrences. They are processes that depend on the actions of a lot of different people and a lot of different factors. So therefore, when we're talking about differential selection and differential processing, the normalization of failure plays a big role. For example, when differential selection is applied to schools, the selection for punishment is based on the judgment of the teacher or authority figure in the room. So if the teachers already expect certain students to fail and have accepted that expectation, they could be more inclined to select those students to be punished. What's to stop the teacher from simply playing their part and sending certain students further down their normalized path of failure? The same goes for the process of differential processing. If the deans, principal, or other higher faculty members who serve as the courts and correctional systems mentioned in the previous definition, if they believe that a portion of the students are supposed to fail, they may be inclined to punish these students more harshly in the event of an incident. Now, looking at these theories may seem a little far-fetched, but if we apply the idea of automatic implicit bias, where we see non-white citizens being turned down from colleges, being turned down from job offers, and even purchases on eBay solely due to the color of their skin, then why wouldn't that be the same in the school systems? A teacher or a principal may not consciously or explicitly choose to punish a student or punish the student more harshly because of the color of their skin, but our implicit biases definitely carry through our actions and decisions. And just because these are automatic or unconscious doesn't give us a pass and say that they don't have real consequences or are beyond our control. So continuing on the relationship between the normalization of failure and the quote-unquote gaps. As a psychology major, I keep thinking of labeling in relation to the phenomena of self-fulfilling prophecy and learned helplessness, which kind of work together, but self-fulfilling prophecy is basically where a student of color may be given the label of a failure and should choose to fulfill that role for the rest of her life. And this is where learned helplessness comes in, where a student really comes to believe that there's no escape from the label they've been given. There's no escape from becoming a failure, so why even try? But overall, the normalization of failure plants the idea that students of color are destined to fail, which perpetuates discrimination and reinforces the connection between the discipline gap and therefore the achievement gap. So moving from individual occurrences to the institutional, we talked about in class and throughout the readings that these incidents are not isolated to individual students, teachers, schools, or states. This is happening all around the country. Therefore, there are ramifications for entire groups of people, making them more susceptible to the discipline gap, school pushout, and school to prison pipeline overall. An important part of this concept is intersectionality, which, at its most basic definition, is the recognition that a person is made up of a collection of identities that are interconnected and each contribute to one's privileges and oppressions. This quote here from Burge, Lacona, and Hemingway does a very good job of addressing school pushout and school to prison pipeline with intersectionality in mind. It reads here, when you're talking about the school to prison pipeline, you do need to consider every piece of someone's identity. So if you're a youth of color and you're also LGBT, you are at higher risk of being pushed out of school because of racism within our school system and because of homophobia within the school system. So this quote, This quote does a very good job of addressing school pushout and school to prison pipeline with intersectionality in mind, because it highlights the necessity of addressing every part of someone's identity and plainly and simply explains how LGBTQ students of color are at an increased risk of school pushout because of the combination of racism and homophobia that present themselves in school systems. So, moving to LGBTQ and gender nonconforming or GNC youth of color, these groups are specifically addressed by the researchers in this article and are a perfect example, among many others, of a particular population that is more susceptible to disciplinary gaps or to the disciplinary gap. So, let's see. There are reported heightened risks, as far as evidence goes, experienced by LGBTQ and GNC populations that the authors list, including like increased reports threat and injury with a weapon, increased reports of depression and serious thoughts or plans of suicide, and increased reports of weaker ties with school, adults, and larger communities. But really, why are these populations at risk? Among the many factors at play, one of them could be the role that appearance plays in our society, schools included. So this quote, which comes from a student within the article, reads or demonstrates the way that appearance can serve as both an advantage and a disadvantage in the school system. But the role of judgment based on appearance is present throughout the entire pipeline and throughout society. And since appearance is one of the primary ways that judgments are made about people and populations, it's key to understanding why certain populations are more susceptible to discipline, school pushout, and the school to prison pipeline. So we'll talk about population susceptibility and the role that appearance plays in that. For the way that appearance influences assistance and support when it's needed, a student explains that if a Latina was bullying her, the principal would stop it relatively quickly. But if the bully was white, it would take 3 or 4 months. This quote highlights how the color of someone's skin carries oppressions and privileges, but also illustrates differential selection in action. For LGBTQ and GNC populations, appearance plays an important role in the way that a person expresses their gender. The authors writes that a GNC person may express their gender through the clothes they wear, the activities they engage in, the pronouns they use, and or the mannerisms. And this expression may embrace masculinity, femininity, neither or both. So out of this particular group comes a discouraging tendency for students, teachers, and faculty of school to blame the victim. In reference to a transgender student of color being bullied and harassed, the authors quote the school staff saying, when she wore hair extensions to school, she's basically asking to be bullied. Since the appearance of this particular student was seen as problematic by the other students and faculty, they felt authorized and entitled to make fun of her and talk behind her back. But appearance is such an important part of the expression of LGBTQ and GNC populations that such treatment really increases the population's susceptibility to school pushout and the school to prison pipeline. The role that appearance plays in society really makes me think of mass criminalization of Black and brown students, that a topic that we touched on in the early portions of the class. But basically, it makes me think of how criminal connections are made with appearance as a key form of racial expression. So do-rags, baggy pants, they all become criminalized as characteristics of thugs and gangsters when free expression is really no crime at all. So all in all, these readings have, as always, have challenged me to and showed new perspectives on issues that I thought were beyond me. However, just because I don't experience normalization of failure and differential selection and processing firsthand doesn't mean that I don't have an influence. It doesn't mean that it doesn't affect me. As I've continuously learned throughout this class, one can't be neutral. When it comes to the school systems and the direction that our country is moving, we have to pick a side. So yeah, that's my presentation. Thank you very much.